that word you use?
Spoilers.
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 Spoilers. Spoilers. Spoilers.
I like that word.
I thought you might.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another brief history and part 2 of my complete guide to TimeLord Victorious. Now first things first, if you haven't yet, I urge you to go and watch part 1 before you watch part 2. As in that video I explain how the chart behind me works, what all the different categories are, all the information that's in the different categories, and how the information in this video will be laid out. And it's far easier for me to advise just watching part 1 than me having to relay all of that information once again in part 2. So today we're going to be looking at the timeline of the 10th Doctor and the Daleks, which, like in the previous videos for the 8th and 9th, are going to be colour-coded, with the 10th Doctor in blue and the Daleks in yellow. So if you give me a moment, I will set up the 10th Doctor's timeline and take you all through it. So here we have the 10th Doctor's narrative all laid out in blue. It's a little bit difficult to see against the green, but it is blue. So the 10th Doctor's narrative actually starts here with Defender of the Daleks, but before we get into this, we have, of course, once again, need to lead into it with a few sort of background pieces of information, for which we start here once again with the sequence of the TimeLord Victorious, most notably number 3, which gives us some information about the planet Mordila, which we're going to come back to in a minute, and also number 4, which makes mention of the Hond, which we're also going to come back to. We then need to look at Riversong's Guide to the Dark Times, which gives a bit more of the 10th Doctor's involvement, obviously as the central party to all of this, but it also makes mention of the Rachnos, who also get a mention obviously in Road to the Dark Times with the Runaway Bride. Just again, pieces of background information that are useful because they were around during the Dark Times. But that's really all you need to know in terms of background information from other TimeLord Victorious. However, still, before we get into Defender of the Daleks, we need to look at 2 other comics which actually lead into the events of this, although they are not part of the overall TimeLord Victorious narrative. The first one is With a Little Help from My Friends, which sees the 13th Doctor and co meet with the 10th Doctor and Martha when they are stranded in 1969 during the events of Blink. And this story sees them take on both the Weeping Angels and the Autons, who they manage to defeat. However, what is important about this is it is this meeting between the 10th and 13th Doctors which causes a paradox and causes a future paradoxical timeline which sees the Sea Devils as the leaders of Earth. And that leads into the events of Alternating Current. Now in Alternating Current, as I said, it shows a future where the Sea Devils are the rulers of Earth. However, it is also a quasi-semi-sequel to Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror, and once again sees the 13th Doctor meeting up with the 10th, albeit this 10th Doctor is from after the events of Voyage of the Damned when he is travelling on his own. And this 10th Doctor has met an alternate Rose Tyler in this paradoxical future who never met him and is a freedom fighter against the Sea Devils. In the end, they manage to defeat the Sea Devils, and the 10th Doctor takes Rose back to her paradoxical timeline, but realising there is now nothing left for her there, he decides to leave her on another planet that needs liberating. But now that paradox is resolved. It does mean that the 10th Doctor no longer has any knowledge of that paradox, and that is where we begin with Defender of the Daleks. In Defender of the Daleks, the 10th Doctor finds himself, with his memory unsure of what he was just doing, in another paradoxical timeline, albeit he doesn't realise at this point that this is one that is created by his own meddling in his own future in the Dark Times. This story sees the Daleks recruit the 10th Doctor to fight against an enemy that is invading them known as the Hond, which leads back to the sequence of the TimeLord Victorious. He manages to defeat the Hond, but then decides to escape from the Daleks before they can recruit him into their own means. Of course, as we know, they later recruited the 8th Doctor for their own means, and this comic does make hint of that. However, the Doctor escapes, and this leads into the events of the TV stories Waters of Mars. Now, Waters of Mars is obviously a very well-known story. This is where the TimeLord Victorious begins, as it were, because the 10th Doctor, realising he is the only Time Lord left alive, decides that the laws of time will obey him, and he can change the future as he sees fit and save who he sees fit. So he saves Adelaide Brooke from dying on Mars, although she does later commit suicide. But it is this paradox of saving her which actually leads to the creation of the time fracture itself, which is not linked directly to this, but it is worth noting that this is where the time fracture comes into this. And so the Doctor journeys through the time fracture into the dark times, which is what we see in, or what we read about in the short newsletter bit, what the Time Lord thought of the Time Lord Victorious. And it is also worth noting that it is probably around this time, or at least at some point after travelling through the time fracture, that both the events of time fracture, the multi-Doctor event which occurs, and also losing his shoe as seen in one of the vlogs, most likely occurs during this time. Again, it's not directly linked into it, but from travelling through the dark times, we come to The Night, the Fool and the Dead. In The Night, the Fool and the Dead, the Doctor finds himself in the dark times on the planet Andalia, where he sees a scientist creating what is known as a life shroud, which is said to hold off death. And it is also at this point that he meets up with Brian the Ood and encounters the Couture for the first time. However, the Couture decide that they are going to make death happen as they see fit, which is why they grant some civilizations and some beings lifespans as they see fit. The Doctor, obviously not wanting death to be a thing anymore, decides that he doesn't like this and decides to challenge them, inadvertently giving them only a lifespan of 15 minutes. He then decides to tackle the Couture at their homeworld and finally wipe them out. But before he manages to do this, he is accosted by his 8th and 9th incarnations, or the 8th and 9th Doctors, who just decide to try and stop him. However, this doesn't work, and he fires on the Couture's fleet, engaging in a 3-way battle between himself, the Couture, 4-way battle even, because it also includes the Doctor, the Daleks, the 8th Doctor and the Daleks, and also the 9th Doctor and the Great Vampires. However, this leads into the events of chapters 1 to 3 of All Flesh is Grass, where the Doctor, realising that he has failed as the Time Lord Victorious, takes Brian, his flagship powered by his TARDIS, and makes his escape, which leads us to Tales of the Dark Times Episode 1. However, just before we get into Tales of the Dark Times Episode 1, there is a couple of little things that are worth noting. Firstly, it is probably during this period that we come down here to the 4 Doctors, which is not part of the Time Lord Victorious as a whole. But those who have read it will know there is a page which features an alternate future for the 10th Doctor where he has become the Time Lord Victorious. And so because the events of that timeline occur due to him letting Wilf die, it is obviously not his a timeline where he succeeded in his plan in stopping death, but I theorise, for a little fan theory moment, that this is probably an alternate future if he had succeeded in the All Flesh is Grass scenario. So it is just interesting to put that there because it is not part of the Time Lord Victorious narrative, but I thought I would put it there as a little sidestep. We then also have a little bit of a continuity / plot hole here with Tales of the Dark Times Episode 1, because in All Flesh is Grass chapters 1 to 3, he eventually discards his collar and robes. But then here, in Tales of the Dark Times Episode 1, he is once again wearing them. However, which we will come back to this in a minute, later on he does end up redonning the robes, so perhaps he just decided not to discard them entirely. Either way, this brings us to Tales of the Dark Times Episode 1, which sees Brian and the 10th Doctor arrive on a desert planet where the 10th Doctor is surrounded by small orbs, which Brian can't see, and the 10th Doctor believes to be the last remnants of a race who need saving, and who are currently teaching him information and their secrets from their holy writs and textbooks. However, Brian points out that these are in fact ghosts of a lost race, and the Doctor has been duped, as he cannot name the holy books he is supposedly being taught about when he is asked about it. And so, after realising that he is unable to save this race, they decide to move on, which brings us to the Mines of Magnox. In the Mines of Magnox, the Doctor and Brian have travelled to Magnox, so the Doctor can ask the Mines if he was just and right in wiping out the Couture. However, at this point, the Couture invade, with their being there present for asking the Mines how they can defeat the Doctor. And so, drawn into a battle with the Couture, he decides to temporarily freeze them to allow the native Maddoxians to escape, and also him and Brian to escape, which leads us back into All Flesh is Grass. Having been convinced by Brian to finally upgrade the weapons on the ship, they decide to go and try and find some more. However, they once again encounter the 8th and 9th Doctors, who have finally caught up with him. And with their help, they rescue the vampire Ehila, who was previously the 9th Doctor's companion in Tales of the Dark Times episode 4, and that they discover that once again the Couture are invading, and also the Daleks. However, the Daleks defeat the Couture fleet, which leads to the Doctors banding together to defeat the Daleks, who have used this time and trip into the Dark Times to harvest the energies and abilities of long since dead life forms, so that they can put them into a single Dalek called a Dalek symbiote. Most notably, they have captured a great old one, i.e. a great vampire. They also discover the Daleks' plans to try and wipe out Gallifrey in the Dark Times to stop the Time Lords from ever existing. In doing so, they travel to the planet Buringi, which is the first homeworld the Couture judged, and encounter the last of the Couture, who then helps them defeat the Daleks, and finally realising that his goal as the TimeLord Victorious was never going to work, the Doctor, leaving Brian behind, decides to leave the Dark Times, which brings us finally to Echoes of Extinction. But just before we get into Echoes of Extinction, it is worth noting that it is probably around this time that the Time Lord collar from the Edge of Time makes an appearance, as it is at this point that the Doctor has discarded it. Echoes of Extinction is in fact the B-side to the Echoes of Extinction A-side of the 8th Doctor. As previously mentioned, the 8th Doctor sent the ruins or remains of a robot down to a nearby planet. The 10th Doctor then encounters these remnants, and in doing so manages to defeat them and decides to set up a warning system telling everyone to stay away from the planet. However, it is this very warning system which brings the 8th Doctor down to the planet, and the 10th Doctor, realising everything his past self is about to go through, finally sees that everything he did as the Time Lord Victorious was not just, and that he finally needs to leave well enough alone. So that is the 10th Doctor's overall timeline. It's a little bit more complex than some of the others, so once again at the end of this video I am going to do a quick breakdown as to the pieces that you really need to focus on if you want to follow his bit of the timeline. But now we get on to the Daleks, and this one is a little bit more interesting, so if you'll give me a moment I'll put it up on the board. So here in yellow we have the Dalek timeline, as you can see. But to quote the late great Steve McQueen, the next step's a little tricky, because although I haven't laid it out as such, the Dalek timeline is rather Q-shaped. That is, it is a loop with a small tail. But we're going to tackle each bit by bit, so let's start with the loop. And before we begin at the beginning, we have of course some other parts that we just need to go over and clarify. Starting over here with River Song's Guide to the Dark Times, which gives a bit more of a comprehensive look at the Daleks in particular, and we then move on to the Secrets of the Time Lord Victorious. More specifically, Entry 1, which gives a bit more information about the Archive of Ilos, which we'll come back to in Daleks. Part 4, which as previously mentioned, gives some information about the Hond. Part 6, which fills in some details about the Daleks' actual plans themselves. Part 7, which gives some information about the Dalek Emperor. And Part 8, which gives some information about the relationship between the Mechanoids and the Daleks. We then move over to Road to the Dark Times, which features Planet of the Daleks, which is a prequel of sorts to the Daleks episode Sentinel of the Fifth Galaxy, and also Genesis of the Daleks, which is obviously the Daleks' origin story. And then lastly, we come to the Restoration Empire, which is featured in the first 3 releases of the Eaglemoss figures, and it is written from the Emperor's perspective. But the reason I haven't necessarily started the timeline off at this point is it is a bit of a coverall for many different things over the course of the Daleks' whole timeline. So I figured it was best that that was stood alone at the start, rather than having to keep referring back to it at the different times. Either way, the Daleks' timeline starts here in the Eaglemoss Release 1 story, The Last Message, which sees the Emperor of the Daleks receiving a warning from a dead Dalek drone from its own future, warning them about the danger that the Doctor poses to the universe. And realizing that they need to acquire more information, they head to the archives of Ilos, which leads into the first episode of the Daleks CG YouTube series, which sees the Daleks invade the archive of Ilos and try to get the Arcavians to give them access to the archive, who initially refuse but eventually relent. However, when the Daleks gain access to the archive, they discover it empty, and the chief Arcavian reveals that he has found an entity in the archives itself, and it has agreed to save the Arcavians and the information in exchange for the Daleks. Which leads into episode 2 of the Dalek series, Sentinel of the Fifth Galaxy, which sees the Dalek strategist going away to awaken an army of Daleks in order to fight the entity. The entity itself being a slave of the Hond, who we will come back to in a bit. However, when the strategist goes to awaken the army, he finds that the entity has already beaten him there and taken over. However, whilst the entity's goal is to wipe out the Daleks, whilst taking over the Sentinel of the Fifth Galaxy itself, who is charged with looking after the Daleks in suspended animation, it says that it would not be adverse to installing a more reasonable Emperor in the place of the current one, i.e. the Strategist Dalek. Whilst considering it for a brief moment, the strategist eventually refuses, which leads to a battle between the entity-possessed Sentinels and the Daleks of the Restoration Empire. The strategist, meanwhile, returns to the Emperor and defends his failure by saying whilst there was one option, it is perhaps one that the Emperor would not like to have considered. This then leads into the events of the 3rd episode, Planet of the Mechanoids, which sees the Emperor, strategist and the remaining Daleks, who have now failed in fighting back against the entity, to the planet of the Mechanoids, where they try to agree to join forces in order to combat the entity. However, whilst initially failing to do this, the Mechanoid Queen then notices that their defences are failing, and the Emperor reveals that he has in fact led the entity to Mechanus. This then leads into the events of episode 4, The Deadly Ally, in which the Emperor reveals his plan of leading the entity to Mechanus was so that it would in fact destroy the Mechanoids, or at the very least, that the Mechanoids, considering themselves superior to the Daleks, would defeat it. However, the entity itself communicates with the Mechanoids and says that if it is given the last 2 Daleks, i.e. the Emperor and the Strategist, it will leave the Mechanoids in peace. Now knowing the deception of the Dalek Emperor, the Mechanoid Queen abandons him to fight the entity by himself. However, the Dalek Strategist and the Scientist Mechanoid manage to open a portal to the entity's dimension and manage to banish it from whence it came. Having succeeded in seemingly banishing the entity, the Queen decides to show a temporary mercy to the Dalek Strategist and the Emperor by allowing them to leave. However, note that no matter where they flee, the Mechanoids will come and destroy the Daleks. This then leads into the events of episode 5 of Daleks, Day of Reckoning, when the Dalek Strategist and the Emperor return to Skaro and awaken more silver Dalek drones, only to have the Mechanoids suddenly appear and declare war. However, when they see that there are new Daleks, they realise that the Emperor and the Strategist are not, as they thought, the only Daleks left in existence. After tracking down the Strategist Dalek, the Mechanoid Queen and the Mechanoid Scientist agree to allow him to live if he will take the Emperor's place, to which the Strategist seemingly agrees. They then further devise a plan to open a portal to the entity's dimension and send the Emperor into it. When this plan, however, is revealed to the Emperor, the strategist reveals that his actual intentions were to in fact send the mechanoids into the entity's dimension, which he succeeds in doing. However, as they celebrate their victory, the entity speaks through the remains of a destroyed mechanoid, telling them they have no idea what is coming. This then leads into the events of Defender of the Daleks, which as previously mentioned sees the 10th Doctor allying himself with the Daleks to defeat the Hond itself, not just its slave, but the actual Hond. And obviously whilst they do manage to defeat the Hond, it ends up with the Doctor escaping them. However, they then decide that they can recruit another Doctor, which leads into the events of the Enemy of My Enemy. The Enemy of My Enemy sees the Daleks form an alliance with the 8th Doctor, who are now both concerned about the fluctuations in time and the different anomalies that have occurred. Eventually, they come upon a weapon known as the Devolver, which has the ability by killing one life form to erase an entire race from history, and the Doctor realises that the Daleks plan to use it to destroy all other life forms. In the end, however, the uneasy alliance between the Daleks and the Doctor remains, where the Doctor realises that the Devolver's technology existed long before the Time Lords in the Dark Times, and so resolves to head there to find out exactly what has been happening, which leads into Tales of the Dark Times, Episode 3. Right, I've just realised I've made a bit of a mistake here, but it's too late to change it now because it's all tied up. But realistically, because I haven't done it for all the other Doctors, there should be a line here going up to what the TARDIS thought of the TimeLord Victorious, because that's when all the Doctors travel through the time fracture. So realistically, there should be a yellow line going from the Enemy of My Enemy to what the TARDIS thought, down to Tales of the Dark Times, Episode 3. Let's be honest, it was going to happen sooner or later, but at least it's happened on a relatively small thing, and so far it seems to be the only mistake that I've made. As previously mentioned in the last video, this story takes place with the Doctor and the Daleks coming upon a derelict ship filled with Huon particles. The Daleks absorb the Huon particles, intending to use the energy for themselves, but are immediately in trouble, where the Doctor explains that it is not so easy to transmit the different energies for their use. Once again, the Doctor saves the Daleks and they thank him, although he uneasily still accepts, with their alliance being very much uneasy, and reveals that the ship was in fact from a race made extinct by the Couture, who left their information and their ship behind in the hopes that others would find them. After this, we lead into the events of The Knight, the Fool and the Dead, where the 8th Doctor and the Daleks pop up just in time to try and stop the 10th Doctor from firing on the Couture. However, they don't succeed, which leads into the events of All Flesh is Grass. All Flesh is Grass chapters 1 to 4 reveal that the Daleks have now entered into a battle with the Great Vampires as well as the Couture. And eventually, when they attack the Great Vampires, the 8th Doctor uses this chance to escape and meet up with the 9th Doctor. This then leads into the events of the Eagle Moss 2 story, Mission to the Known, which reveals the Daleks' true intentions in the Dark Times, to not only harvest and gain the abilities of long since dead life forms who are still alive in the Dark Times, but also to destroy Gallifrey at its very beginning before the Time Lords have ever even come about. Now, it is worth noting at this point exactly how that fits into the whole Timeless Child thing. We don't know. All we know is that this is Gallifrey during the Dark Times, before the Time Lords ever existed. We know that this is obviously probably sometime after the Timeless Children, given that in the 9th Doctor comic, Monstrous Beauty, Rassilon has been seen to exist. Either way, this leads into the events of Tales of the Dark Times Episode 2, which sees the Daleks travel to the planet Velosia and sees the native Velosians asking the Daleks to save them, being a peaceful race and not wishing to go to war with the Couture, from whom they fear an impending attack. The Daleks form an alliance with the Velosians, agreeing to take only the best and brightest of their race to safety, for which the Velosians gratefully agree. However, they don't realise that the Daleks' true intentions are to in fact harvest them. This then leads back into All Flesh is Grass, chapters 5 to 14, which sees the Doctors finally taking on the Daleks together and the Daleks' intentions to mount an attack on the Dark Times Gallifrey. It is likely around this time as well that the time fracture part of the story where the Daleks intend to destroy Gallifrey perhaps happens. So whilst I haven't linked it into there, it is worth noting that that is when this likely happens. However, during this time and going on from chapters 15 to the end, the Daleks also revealed to have captured a great vampire and are using it to create a Dalek symbiont, the ultimate Dalek warrior, using many of the different abilities they have harvested from races in the Dark Times. However, the Doctors do defeat them, and whilst the 8th Doctor escapes back onto the Dalek ship, it is now crippled, which leads into the events of mutually assured destruction. With the Daleks' time ship now disintegrating and the 8th Doctor finding himself surrounded by Daleks, as previously mentioned in the last video, he manages to escape back in his TARDIS, saving a couple of captives along the way, and fleeing from the Dark Times, leaving the Daleks' time ship to break up in the vortex with many of the Daleks along with it, which leads into the events of the Eaglemoss 3 story, Exit Strategy. Now alone and drifting in the vortex, Exit Strategy sees the Dalek time strategist reflecting on the war that they have just gone to, realising that he doesn't quite want to die yet, and so decides to initiate a emergency temporal shift, also using the couture crystals that he has adapted into his casing, and decides to leave the time vortex to parts unknown. And interestingly, there is an possible implication, or at least an interpretation in this particular story, that the Dalek time strategist may have gone on to become the Emperor seen in the Time War. But again, that is open to interpretation on how you see it. Now, before we get on to the next bit, it is worth coming back up here to the edge of time, where it is likely, due to the Daleks' destruction and the pieces in the time vortex, this is once again specifically where the Executioner's Claw makes an appearance, or at least where it originates from in the context of Edge of Time. But moving back to Exit Strategy, not all of the Daleks are destroyed. At least one survives, and that brings us down here to the TimeLord Victorious trailer, which sees a destroyed drone Dalek sending out a message to warn the Daleks about everything that the Doctor is going to do. And that is actually where the loop for the Daleks closes, because whilst I haven't linked it up, this message that this drone sends out is in fact the message that the Dalek Emperor receives, which kicks off the entire events. And so this whole Dalek timeline is actually something of an ontological or bootstrap paradox. These events only occur because of a warning from a Dalek that has happened after it has occurred. This Dalek has been through all these events, warns the Daleks it's going to happen, and in doing so sets off the events. Hence, loop. I appreciate that ontological bootstrap paradoxes are not very easy for everyone to understand, so for those who aren't quite sure about it, think of it as the 12th Doctor's explanation: who wrote Beethoven's Fifth? It exists because it exists. However, whilst the Dalek's whole timeline loop closes there, this Dalek does have some further adventures, and so in that sense the Dalek timeline continues. So from here, the lone Dalek survivor works its way here to the Hollow Planet in the print off and play game of the same name. In this story, the Dalek itself plans to use the titular Hollow Planet to broadcast its message to the universe. However, with the help of the Doctor, the players, as they are known in the game, manage to stop the Dalek and eject it in an escape pod into space. From here, we work our way up to genetics of the Daleks, but just before we do that, I have a little bit of fan theories territory between here and here, because as is seen in the trailer, the Dalek is a TimeLord Victorious Dalek in the silver with the blue spheres. However, by the time of genetics of the Daleks, it appears to have taken on a bronze Dalek appearance, as is the standard one. And there is obviously the discrepancy between these as to how it goes from being a silver drone to a standard bronze. Well, my theory is that given this is happening within the time vortex to an extent, that it is sent drifting off into space, and that it has been described as repairing itself through sheer force of will, I sort of hazarded a guess, which is not a watertight theory, I admit, that perhaps it found other remnants of Dalek casings that it has used to repair itself or change its casing in that way, or by using the hollow planet to broadcast it has found information about the Daleks and taken on an appearance of a casing that is more akin to the Daleks we know. Again, it's a bit of a plot hole, but I just thought I'd throw that in there to explain it. But we come back here now to genetics of the Daleks. Now, I really don't want to give away too many details about genetics of the Daleks, because personally I think this is actually one of the best releases of the whole TimeLord Victorious narrative. But suffice to say, the Dalek is recovered whilst drifting through the Oort cloud and is brought on board a starship, where there is an ongoing power struggle, or there is a power struggle, for command of the ship. And eventually the Dalek seems to be defeated by the Doctor. However, it is revealed to have survived. And this, interestingly, takes us on from genetics of the Daleks to the trailer for genetics of the Daleks. However, this trailer actually takes place after the events of the story. Still on the remains of the starship, the Dalek is stalking the corridors before exterminating an unseen enemy, perhaps one of the survivors. And this then leads into the final piece of the Dalek narrative, the Dalek Awakens escape room. In this narrative, the participants of a Dalek Awakens, possibly taking the place of crew members of the starship, are tasked by the 13th Doctor to maintain and restabilize the power systems of the starship and stop the Dalek waking up. With further help from the 13th Doctor sending the crew members her sonic screwdriver, they manage to stun the Dalek before bringing the ship's defense systems online and destroying the Dalek once and for all. And there brings to a close the Daleks timeline in TimeLord Victorious. So now there we have the extra 2 parts of the narrative. Again, there is a lot of information here, so for the purposes of those who just want the basic narratives for the 10th Doctor and for the Daleks, here are the stories you need to concentrate on and the order in which you should experience. For the 10th Doctor, we start with Defender of the Daleks, but I'll be honest, if the comics aren't really your thing, you probably can give that one a miss, as it doesn't add a whole lot to the 10th Doctor narrative. But personally, I find it actually quite an interesting comic. As many will know, I am a big fan of the comics, so I would recommend this one if you're interested in doing the whole basic narrative. After that, it is the episode Waters of Mars, then the books The Knight, the Fool and the Dead, followed by All Flesh is Grass, and then in between All Flesh is Grass comes The Mind of Magnox, but if you read the book before you listen to The Minds of Magnox, you'll still understand where this comes in, and then we finish it off with the 10th Doctor's side of Echoes of Extinction. For the Daleks, we begin with the YouTube series Daleks, then Defender of the Daleks, which is more important to the Daleks narrative, so I would recommend it as part of theirs, even if I don't recommend it as part of the 10th Doctor's. Then the big finish stories, The Enemy of My Enemy, then The Knight, the Fool and the Dead and the All Flesh is Grass books, then the Big Finish audio Mutually Assured Destruction, and lastly I would also recommend Genetics of the Daleks. As I said, it is one of my favourites, but it is a bit difficult on the fact that it ends on a cliffhanger. So although I wouldn't necessarily say it is required of the Dalek timeline, it is again one of those ones that you could probably skip and just end on Mutually Assured Destruction. But for now, that brings to a close another A Brief History and part 2 of my complete guide to the TimeLord Victorious. In the next episode, we will be doing Brian the Ood with the black line and the Couture in purple, and then seeing, because I'm going to try and do this before the video, see if it'll work, a main narrative to tie the whole thing up together. But that's for the next video. For now, as always, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Like, favorite, subscribe, share, it really helps me out a lot. Be sure to subscribe below for a link to my Patreon. I'm doing my very first figure animation and you can get involved. There's exclusive content and rewards for those who do so, and funding my Patreon in any way gets your name at the end of my videos. I salute you all, and I will see you with another video very soon.